I'm not ashamed.
Was Jesus the King of the Jews? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Matthew on walking through the Bible.
Honors of his word, the glory of his cross.
If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to Matthew chapter 27. We're going to be reading from verses 11 to 14. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So, Matthew chapter 27, beginning at verse 11. Now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, saying, Are you the King of the Jews? Jesus said to him, It is as you say. And while he was being accused by the chief priests and elders, he answered nothing. Then Pilate said to him, Do you not hear how many things they testify against you? But he answered him not a word, so that the governor marveled greatly. It is now fully morning on what the Jews call the 6th day of the week, what we would call Friday. Jesus had been tried before the Jews and convicted. What had Jesus done to deserve this conviction? Nothing. He had not desecrated the temple, he had not murdered anyone or stolen from anyone. Yet the chief priests and rulers of the Jews hated Jesus for what he taught, which was contrary to their teachings. Jesus had a following that threatened the power and livelihood of the religious class, so the only course of action was to have Jesus killed. Cowardly as they were, though, they could not arrest Jesus during the day because the people would have prevented them. So with the help of Judas, they arrested him at night, and then they tried and convicted him before the people arose from sleep. They could not find any witnesses to agree on the charge, but when Jesus spoke in the affirmative, when asked under oath if he was the Son of God, the settled charge for their purposes was blasphemy. So the Sanhedrin then officially convicted him and sent him to the governor, Pontius Pilate, to be put to death. Judas, seeing that Jesus was condemned, tried to return the money in the hopes that Jesus would be released, but the chief priests simply scoffed at Judas. Seeing no other way out and no way to be forgiven by Jesus, so he thought, Judas went and hung himself. All of this brings us to verse 11. The chief priests are bringing Jesus from the place where he was tried to Pontius Pilate. They had convicted him of blasphemy, but such a charge was not going to mean anything to Pilate, for Pilate didn't believe in God at all. He was likely an idolater. So as verse 1 of the chapter implies, the Jews were coming up with a valid reason that they could give Pilate as to why Jesus needed to be executed by the Romans. Now Matthew doesn't give us their charge, but Luke does. They tell Pilate that Jesus had been perverting the nation, forbidding that taxes be paid unto Caesar, and that he himself is Christ, a king. Even though Matthew leaves this section out, we can know from Pilate's response to them, asking Jesus if he was the King of the Jews, that is their charge. I find it amusing that Pilate, even in Luke's account, didn't ask Jesus if he was perverting the Jewish nation, for Pilate didn't care. Nor did he ask Jesus if he was leading a tax revolt, for he would have certainly heard of such a thing long before, if in fact Jesus had a large enough following to carry out such. No, Pilate was only mildly interested in that third charge, that Jesus was the King of the Jews. The reason that I say mildly is that when Jesus answered yes in verse 11, Pilate didn't immediately convict him of treason. In fact, Luke says he was going to let him go. Pilate would have been looking at Jesus and his appearance, and most likely thought to himself that Jesus didn't look like a king. He didn't have armies that posed a threat to Caesar. He wasn't even trying to defend himself. In other words, Jesus wasn't acting like a king, and therefore, as we'll see in the next episode, Pilate saw through the charges as to the real reason that Jesus was standing before him, which was because of envy. The chief priests hated Jesus so much that they had concocted a charge so that Pilate would execute him. The chief priests were not going to be denied, however, and so they continued accusing him of things, to which Pilate basically asked Jesus, Aren't you going to answer these charges? An innocent man typically declares his innocence and pleads for his life, but Jesus was doing none of that. Why? Because as we discussed a few episodes ago, it was prophesied. In Isaiah 53 verse 7 we read, He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. Jesus was the Son of God and was declared to be so, not only by God the Father on 2 separate occasions, but by his teachings and miracles. He was not guilty of any of the charges brought forth by the chief priests. Yet he needed to be put to death if mankind was to have their sins washed away. He didn't refute the charges before the Jews so that they would actually convict him, and he wasn't going to refute the charges before Pilate so that Pilate wouldn't actually release him. Jesus' silence left Pilate marveling, for he had never seen a defendant quite like Jesus, a man who Pilate knew was innocent, but who was unwilling to defend himself. We'll continue with this story, the Lord willing, in the next episode. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Matthew 27, verses 15 to 26, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time.
I'm not ashamed.
Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.
Of his cross.